Well, think about maps before the age of modern nation-states and empires. They were often quite different. You had cosmographs, focused on spiritual or symbolic geography, showing the relationship between the earthly realm and the heavens. Or you had practical guides for specific journeys, pilgrimage routes, campaign maps, trade routes, often without clear, fixed borders.
More like itineraries or diagrams than the bordered maps we know today.
Right. Richard Muir's description of modern international boundaries is key here. He calls them vertical interfaces, defining sovereign authority, lines that have technically no horizontal extent. They are sharp, invisible lines slicing through the air and across the ground, defining absolute sovereignty within a specific perimeter.
They create a clear us inside and them outside. And crucially, in the colonial context especially, the map often anticipated spatial reality rather than simply reflecting it. The borders were frequently drawn arbitrarily on maps in European capitals along lines of longitude or latitude, following rivers that hadn't even been fully explored based on treaties between colonial powers long before the colonial state had any real administrative control on the ground.
So the map came first, and then the state tried to make reality conform to it.
In many cases, yes. The map became a model for what the state intended to make real, a blueprint for projecting power onto the Earth's surface, backed up eventually by military force. Mapping became a core discourse shaping both colonial administration, where do we collect taxes, where do our laws apply, and military strategy, where are the borders we must defend.
So the map wasn't just a picture. It was literally an instrument of power, a plan for domination and control.
And because of mechanical reproduction, the modern bordered map became infinitely reproducible. It can be printed cheaply and widely on posters, on official seals, in school textbooks, on postage stamps, everywhere.
It became visually ubiquitous.
Exactly. This widespread circulation meant the map, the shape of the colony, penetrated the popular imagination as a powerful, easily recognizable logo or emblem for that territory. And then, in this remarkable historical irony, this very tool of imperial power, this logo, became a potent symbol for the anti-colonial nationalisms that arose later.
The outline of the colony on the map became the desired shape, the sacred territory of the future independent nation.
Precisely. Think of the map of Africa, famously carved up with straight lines by European powers. Those artificial lines, drawn on maps, largely became the borders of independent African nations.
No.
Or the outline of British India becoming the instantly recognizable symbol for the Indian independence movement. The map provided the visual form of the imagined community.
Any specific examples?
Anderson used the example of Dutch New Guinea, West Papua. Its western border with British, later Australian New Guinea, was literally the 141st meridian of east longitude, a completely invisible line drawn on paper, cutting through diverse landscapes and communities. The Dutch only fully incorporated this vast territory relatively late in their colonial rule. Yet that line defined the territory.
And the Dutch used it.
They used its remote, inaccessible swamps defined by that map as prison camps for Indonesian nationalists fighting for independence from the Dutch. It shows how the abstract line on the map created and defined a physical reality the state worked to control. And conversely, those Indonesian nationalists saw the map of the entire Netherlands East Indies, including West New Guinea, as the non-negotiable territory of the future nation of Indonesia. The map became the ground of struggle.
Wow, okay, census, map, and finally the museum and archaeology. How did digging up old ruins fit into this state imagination project?
Colonial states often sponsored archaeological work, uncovering and restoring ancient temples, palaces, monuments. But they tended to present these findings not just as historical artifacts, but as linked series of ancient monuments that were segmented within the specific administrative and geographic box of the colony.
So ruins in, say, Burma were presented as ancient monuments of British Burma, implicitly distinct from related ruins just across the border in Siam or French Indochina, even if they shared deep historical or cultural connections.
Exactly. They were segmenting ancient history along modern colonial administrative lines. These restored or documented ruins then became available for state surveillance. You knew where they were, and crucially for infinite replication through photography, drawings, models, guidebooks, maps.
Making them visible and controllable.
Yes. And the state could then regard this series of ancient monuments, stretching back through historical time but located within its defined borders, as a kind of album of its own ancestors. It created a legitimizing historical depth of field for the modern colonial entity itself. It associated the recent colonial state with a deep, tangible, monumental past within those specific boundaries.
So The state wasn't necessarily interested in the ruins for their own sake or their broader historical context, but more in how they could be used to claim a long history for the territory the state now controlled.
That seems to be the core logic. It was about constructing a narrative of historical continuity and legitimacy within the state lines on the map. So you put these three things together. The census creating a defined, classified population grid, the map defining a bounded, logoized territory, and the museum archaeology providing a claimed historical depth within that territory. Anderson argues these tools, often deployed together by the colonial state, shaped the fundamental grammar that eventually made it possible for people to imagine entities like Burma and Burmese, or Indonesia and Indonesians, tied to that specific land with that purportedly shared ancient past mapped onto it.
It's really incredible how these seemingly bureaucratic or academic tools, counting people, drawing lines, digging up ruins, were so instrumental in literally constructing the very identities and territories that would define the modern world.
This whole process of concretization, of making the nation imaginable, owed a huge amount to the colonial state's peculiar way of imagining and representing history and power through these instruments of classification, demarcation, and historical narration.
This brings us back again, I think, to time and memory. If nations are constructed in this homogeneous, empty time we talked about, this secular, serial flow, and if those old anchors of cosmology and divine history are gone, how do people find a sense of identity and continuity? Where does the story come from?
Well, that very awareness of being embedded in this linear, anonymous time, combined with the profound historical ruptures of the late 18th century that just fundamentally altered how people understood their place in the world. The decline of those old certainties, it created a deep need for a new kind of narrative, a new way to link oneself to the past and the future. And the nation provides this, Anderson argues, in the form of a biography.
A biography for the nation, just like a life story for a person.
Yes, but it's a peculiar kind of biography. The nation's antiquity, as we've seen, isn't usually discovered in some objective sense. It's often constructed or selectively rediscovered, often through things like language and carefully curated historical narratives.
Language plays a big role here, doesn't it?
Huge. Language feels primordial, doesn't it? It feels like something you inherit, almost biologically, like a family trait. No one knows exactly when a language was born or when it will finally die. It seems to stretch back into this horizonless past, and it connects us very effectively, emotionally, to the dead.
Like hearing really old phrases or poems that resonate not just for their meaning, but for the sheer weight of history you feel they carry.
Exactly. Anderson uses the example of the phrase earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust from the English burial service. He suggests it resonates so deeply, not just because of its religious meaning, but because it feels like it carries the accumulated weight of centuries of ancestral Englishness, somehow connecting the living gathered at the graveside to generations upon generations of the dead who heard or spoke similar words.
So language feels like a historical fatality. You're just born into it, but it's also constantly changing and open to new speakers.
Which makes it a very flexible vehicle for constructing this sense of ancient continuity that feels both deeply natural and yet somehow enduring and adaptable.
And this whole idea of constructing identity through selective memory, through telling a particular story, leads us directly to Ernest Renan's famous 1882 lecture, What is a Nation, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Renan's formulation is just brilliant, and it gets right to the heart of this constructed nature of national memory. He famously stated that the essence of a nation lies in two things, that all individuals have many things in common, and also, crucially, that all have forgotten many things.
Forgotten many things. That's the intriguing part. What exactly does he mean by forgetting? How can a whole nation forget?
Well, this is where the paradox comes in, as Anderson points out. Renan gives examples of things French citizens must have collectively forgotten in order to constitute the unified French nation. Things like the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572, Catholics slaughtering Protestant Huguenots, or the brutal massacres of the Albigensians in the south of France during the 13th century, basically a crusade against a religious minority.
Horrific events, but how could they forget them?
That's the paradox. Renan is giving this lecture in 1882, and he clearly assumes his educated French audience knows about these historical events. You can't forget something you've never heard of in the first place.
Ah, okay. So the forgetting isn't about genuine ignorance or amnesia. It's about something else, a specific kind of state-sponsored reframing.
Precisely. Anderson argues it points towards a deliberate, often state-led, historiographical campaign conducted primarily through things like public education, national commemorations, official histories designed to remind citizens of certain historical events, to inscribe them into the collective memory as our history, part of the family story of the nation,
Okay.
while simultaneously requiring them to forget the original, often deeply divisive or problematic implications of those events.
So take the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Originally, it was a horrific conflict between groups Catholics and Protestants who absolutely did not see themselves as fellow Frenchmen in the way we think of it now. How does the forgetting work there?
It gets reframed. It's presented not as Catholics versus Protestants with complex international ties, but as a tragic yet ultimately internal struggle, a kind of regrettable but unifying fratricidal war within the French family. Anderson calls this a tropology, using language and narrative to reshape the meaning of the past.
How does that work?
By calling it simply La Saint-Barthélemy, or the 13th century massacres of the Midi, it obscures the specific identities of the participants. It hides the fact that many victims in the Midi spoke Provençal or Catalan, not French, and that the perpetrators included crusaders from across Europe, sanctioned by the Pope. It makes it sound like an internal French affair, a contained conflict within a pre-existing, continuous French nation that stretches back to encompass these events.
So this selective remembering and strategic forgetting weaves these potentially disruptive, heterogeneous historical events into a single, seamless national biography, creating the illusion of an ancient, unified continuity right up to the present.
Exactly. Another classic example Anderson uses is William the Conqueror in English history. Every English school child learns his name, 1066 and all that.
Right, Battle of Hastings.
But they aren't typically taught that William the Conqueror spoke Norman French, and certainly no English, because modern English as we know it didn't even exist back then. Or the question, conqueror of what? Because if you explicitly say he conquered the English, well, that makes him a foreign invader, like Napoleon or Hitler trying to conquer England. That fundamentally disrupts the narrative of a continuous, unbroken English nation.
It makes 1066 an external invasion, not just a change of management within the family.
Precisely. So, calling him simply William the Conqueror acts as a kind of ellipsis. It reminds everyone of the hugely important event of 1066, but requires you to forget its deeply disruptive implications. The foreignness, the conquest. It allows Norman William and Saxon Harold to be subtly reframed, metaphorically, as belonging to the same historical trajectory, part of the same foundational story of England.
It smooths over the conquest, domesticates it, makes it part of the nation's internal story.
Right. And this national biography, constructed through such remembering and forgetting, is different from an individual's biography in key ways. A person has a clear birth and usually a clear death. But a nation, it typically has no empirically verifiable birth date. It fades back into myth, and its deaths are never seen as natural.
How do nations die in this narrative?
They're experienced as annihilation, genocide, tragic loss, defeat, never just fading away naturally. And the nation's biography can't really be written simply downtime from a single originator, the way a person's life story often is. Instead, it's fashioned uptime, constructing a narrative that reaches back towards ancient, often mythical origins, creating that sense of depth.
And instead of being marked by the slow, anonymous accumulation of births and deaths that defines demographic history.
Right, the kind of history someone like the historian Fernand Braudel might focus on anonymous mortality rates, population trends over centuries.
Instead of that, the nation's biography is punctuated by specific, often violent deaths.
Yes. It's structured by exemplary suicides, like national heroes choosing death over surrender, martyrs dying for the cause, pivotal wars, traumatic Holocaust-specific, often violent, deaths that are collectively remembered or sometimes strategically forgotten as our own. These specific deaths become foundational moments, moments that seem to unify the community through shared sacrifice, shared grief, or shared trauma, giving the abstract nation concrete moments of shared experience and time.
So this whole process of constructing a usable past, remembering certain things, forgetting others, framing events in a very particular way is absolutely fundamental to creating and maintaining that powerful sense of shared history and collective identity that defines a nation.
It absolutely is. Which leads us finally to an important distinction Anderson makes, the difference between patriotism and nationalism, which he argues inspire love, and racism, which he sees as dreaming of eternal contamination.
That distinction feels really crucial, especially with how these terms get used and sometimes confused today. How does he see patriotism and nationalism inspiring love?
He argues that they genuinely do inspire love, often a deeply self-sacrificing kind. Just think about the common idioms people use to talk about their nation. Motherland, fatherland, patria, heimat, tanah air, which means earth and water in Malay Indonesian.
Terms drawn from family and home.
Exactly. They draw on the language of kinship and home, the most fundamental, seemingly natural ties. These idioms denote something that feels natural, unchosen, like your parents, like your birthplace, maybe like your skin color. And this feeling of being born into the nation, just like being born into a family, gives patriotism this halo of disinterestedness. It feels like a natural affection, a love for something fundamental and inherent to who you are, not something you chose for, say, economic benefit.
So it feels like a pure natural affection, not a calculated loyalty based on self-interest.
And you see this affection expressed constantly in national culture, in poetry, literature, songs, anthems. Anderson quotes a really powerful example.
Yeah.
Jose Rizal, the Philippine national hero, writing his poem, Mi Último Adiós, My Last Farewell, the night before his execution by the Spanish colonial authorities in 1896. It's this incredibly moving, passionate expression of love for his patria adorada, his adored homeland, the Philippines. But crucially, he writes it in Spanish, the language of the colonizer, and the poem focuses entirely on his love for the Philippines itself, the land, the people, the imagined community. He doesn't even mention the nationality of his oppressors or executioners.
Wow. That really highlights the focus being purely on the love for the imagined community, the homeland itself, not on hatred of the other.
Exactly. Now contrast that, Anderson suggests, with racism. He argues that racism's origins lie less in nationalism and more in older ideologies of class and aristocracy.
Class and aristocracy, how so?
Think about historical claims to divinity or semi-divinity among rulers, separating them fundamentally from commoners, or the intense aristocratic obsession with blue blood, with breeding, with maintaining the purity of lineages to justify their inherent superiority and right to rule. It's about claims of inherent biological difference and superiority.
So it's about an inherent biological status, often linked to lineage, not necessarily tied to a specific territory or shared history in the same way nationalism is.
That's the core idea. Racism, in this view, dreams of eternal contamination. It imagines difference as something immutable, transmitted biologically, outside of history, through blood. Think of phrases like the tar brush, the idea that even one drop of non-white ancestry irrevocably contaminates your lineage, makes you essentially non-white, or concepts like the seed of Abraham.
It's about an unchangeable biological essence.
Exactly. And from this perspective, things like nationality, language, culture, citizenship, they become fundamentally irrelevant compared to this underlying, unchanging biological nature. The Nazi view of a Jewish German perfectly illustrates this. It didn't matter how many generations a family had lived in Germany, how assimilated they were culturally, what language they spoke, whether they fought for Germany in wars. Their blood marked them as an eternal, contaminating outsider, an imposter within the German nation.
So racism is rooted in this idea of immutable biological essentialism, whereas nationalism, however constructed, is more about historical destiny, shared belonging, and cultural identity tied to a territory.
Yes. Nationalism thinks in terms of historical destinies, things that unfold and change over time, things that can potentially be achieved or joined. Racism thinks in terms of timeless biological essences that cannot be changed or escaped.
And where do they typically manifest?
Anderson argues that racism, and particularly modern anti-Semitism, primarily manifest within national boundaries. They function as ideologies used to justify domestic repression, internal purification, domination, and exclusion, defining who truly belongs inside the national community and who is perceived as an eternal contaminating other that must be controlled or eliminated.
So it's more about internal policing of boundaries.
Often, yes. While racist ideas can certainly be used to justify imperial domination over colonized populations seen as racially inferior, their core logic, Anderson suggests, often operates internally, defining the true nation against internal others.
Which is different from nationalism, which often drives conflict between different national units based on competing historical claims, territorial disputes, or struggles for dominance.
Right. Patriotism, that love for the nation like other affections, involves this element of fond imagining your connection to millions of anonymous fellow nationals, imagining the homeland, imagining historical figures reframed as your ancestors. Racism, conversely, is fueled by a deep fear and hatred of a perceived, immutable biological contamination, a static, timeless otherness that supposedly cannot be changed or assimilated.
It really boils down to the difference between a powerful constructed love for us, the imagined national community, and a powerful fear or hatred of them, the eternally contaminating other, rooted in fundamentally different ways of thinking about identity, history, and belonging.
And that love, that patriotism, that deep, seemingly natural affection for the imagined community of the nation is precisely why, Anderson concludes, people are willing to make the ultimate sacrifice for it. It feels like dying for something as natural, as unchosen, and as eternal as family or home, even though, as we've spent this whole deep dive exploring, the nation is a concept forged in very specific, relatively recent modern historical conditions.
This has been a truly fascinating journey, really unpacking Anderson's ideas. We've gone from seeing nations as these cultural artifacts, these imagined communities.
Tracing their possibility back to the erosion of those ancient certainties, the sacred language, the divine monarch, that medieval sense of time.
And we saw how print capitalism acted as this crucial engine, standardizing vernacular languages and creating new communities of readers through things like the newspaper, fostering that sense of simultaneous shared experience among total strangers.
Yeah, making the imagined feel real. And we explored how these national imaginings first took concrete shape in phenomena like the Creole nationalisms in the Americas, and then later in those reactive, top-down, official nationalisms of threatened empires.
Often shaped, ironically, by the very administrative structures and boundaries created by the imperial state itself.
Exactly. And then we looked closely at how the state used those key tools, the census, the map, the museum, especially in the colonial era, to define populations, delineate territories, and construct a sense of historical depth within those boundaries, effectively providing the grammar for imagining future nations.
And finally, we touched on that vital role of history and memory, the way nations are built through selective remembering and deliberate forgetting, crafting a usable biography for the nation.
And drawing that critical distinction between the love inspired by patriotism for the imagined community and the fear and hatred often associated with racism, highlighting their very different origins and logics, historical destiny versus eternal contamination.
It really underscores how the immense power of nationalism lies not just in obvious politics or economics, but deep in its cultural ability to transform the contingent facts of history and birth into this powerful, subjective feeling of destiny, belonging, and enduring collective identity.
Making the modern feel ancient, the constructed feel natural.
So for you listening, thinking about all this, that nations are imagined communities, shaped by historical forces like print, by state tools like maps and censuses, and maintained through these complex processes of remembering and forgetting, how does that shift the way you perceive the naturalness of your own national identity?
Yeah, what key moments, figures, or narratives are constantly celebrated or emphasized in your nation's story? And perhaps more interestingly, what aspects, conflicts, or inconvenient histories are less discussed, maybe glossed over, or conveniently forgotten?
And what might reflecting on that tell you about how the particular we of your nation was imagined into being, and who might have been included or excluded in that imagining?
Definitely something to ponder as you navigate this world, still so powerfully defined by these imagined, yet very real boundaries.
Absolutely. Well, that's all the time we have for this deep dive into imagined communities. We really hope it gave you a richer, maybe more critical perspective on something that shapes all our lives in profound ways.
Until next time.